Okay, good evening. Today is Tuesday, January 22nd, and a meeting of the Salem-Keizer School Board is called to order. Would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay.
A point of privilege. CCTV has asked that we use our mics tonight so they can hear us.
Excellent point. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So, for the record, we have two board members who are absent this evening. Chuck Lee is absent, and Chair Goss is also absent this evening. So I'll be chairing the meeting. Oh, I'm sorry. Three. And Director Hine is absent this evening.
Oh, here she comes.
Oh, change that. So Director Hine is here. Okay. And we have no agenda modifications. I am going to just point out, though, kind of what we're doing is a little different this evening. So we are going to start our meeting with a work session, and it's going to be a work session for the board on the boundary changes, which will give us the opportunity to ask any clarifying questions, have a discussion, and then we will move into public comment. So we will close the work session and open the regular public meeting and take public comment on agenda items. So that will include the boundary adjustment process and could include an amendment to Howard Street Charter School as presented this evening. So we're going to start with the work session.
All right. Good evening, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike Wolf, who will, I think, very quickly turn it over to a couple others, but there you go.
Here we go. Good evening. You have your binders, and I know that you've taken a look at the material from the last meeting, and so we're going to spend as much time as you need with any questions that you might have. The outcomes for tonight, the work session, is to review the task force recommendations. We have the school-by-school changes that are part of your binder. It's also listed on the maps in the call-out boxes. There's basically 33 call-out boxes that live at the three different levels, elementary, middle, and high. You take a look at whatever feeder system adjustments that you would like to talk about. We can review those. And then the additional recommendations from the task force. And as a way to help you focus on those additional recommendations, we were also asked as staff to take a look at the additional recommendations, do staff work in support of them. And so basically what you have coming around is staff responses. So the additional recommendations from the task force are in the black bullet statements, and staff response is in the blue font underneath each of those. So I'll give you a second for that document to come around. I thought what we would do is go through each of the changes briefly, just so you know kind of what we're talking about. You have the order of magnitude of change in your stats sheet. As you may recall, Adam went through that. It might be good to, I'll take a page out of Adam's book as far as presentation. It may be good to either take them out of your binder or go ahead and just open your binder to your overview table charts so that you can follow along the changes and also the impacts at each school. The maps that were handed out to you tonight, just want to orient you a little bit more to the material. One of the recommendations that we'll briefly touch on that the task force made was for staff to go ahead and do a final review to make sure that we didn't inadvertently draw a boundary through someone's property line, and also take a look at what implications there might be, minor changes that would really help with transportation. A lot of cases we have routes that just by moving, between one property and another, we can actually save a bus or a bus run in those areas. So we took a look at those, and we have added those to your maps and call-out boxes using A through H. So the only difference between the maps that you had in your binders and the ones that we're adding tonight, that we handed out tonight, have those alpha character boxes called out A through H. And I can tell you that the vast majority of those changes don't affect any kids, but there is one in particular that I'd want to call your attention to that once we get to that point. So that's kind of the orientation of the material. So what I'd like to do is, if you have your maps open and you have your overview table available, then I'm going to stand up over by these maps. Instead of doing a presentation, I can bring the maps right to you, the big board, if you'd like. And I just kind of want to give you a quick overview of where we've been. So the busiest map is the elementary level, as you can see. Now again, some of the areas that we focused on when we were going through, besides the guiding principles and the equity focus that we've been talking about, we also wanted to make sure that we were very mindful. We had maps that also showed the walk zones at each school, and we wanted to be very careful that we weren't moving kids out of a walk zone and busing them to another school if it wasn't absolutely necessary. And I don't believe that we ended up doing that in any of the recommendations. So that was another sort of check that the task force did through the process. Okay. The other thing is, when you look at the overview sheet and you see the percentage of over or under capacity in the 5 or 10-year columns, you'll notice that some schools are over 100% capacity in either 5 or 10 years out with the boundary change. Okay. One of the things that we worked on, again, the task force was an iterative process. It's not like we had everything figured out the first meeting. It took several meetings. You build on a recommendation or a thought. And so as we were working through the process and gathering input from the community, we really took on the mantra of, hey, let's make sure we're only moving students that we absolutely need to move. So minimize the impact to the greatest extent possible. And I think, not that the task force needed permission, but I think at one of the meetings we said, hey, look, you don't have to move 3 kids to get the capacity number to 99% in 10 years. That makes sense? In other words, let's be careful and mindful about moving students around. And it's okay to have a capacity between 75% utilization and 110%, let's say, if that meant that we could minimize the disruption throughout the process. So when you look at some of those percentages across the board, you'll notice some of them are pushing at 106, 107, 110, and we know Miller, for instance, is well above that, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. I'm open for questions throughout.
Oh, I'm
that
sorry.
Works?
Director Hein, please.
Sorry. For task force recommendations, does that also include the bond changes, or is this boundary changes only?
We're going to get into the bond changes as well. Those were the additional task force recommendations, addition to just the boundary changes, but were part of the process.
But what are these numbers? Are they just the boundary change or boundary plus bond?
Those numbers include post-bond capacity.
Okay,
Yep.
that's what I need to know.
Yep,
Thank you.
absolutely. Okay, so those were some of the other considerations that the task force took into account. So you can see that the balancing between, I'll take the McNary feeder system first. You can see that there's movement, like for instance, box number 3 from Gubser to Keizer. You can also see that there's movement, box number 4, from Keizer to Kennedy. You can see box number 5 that there's movement from Keizer to Cummings. all of that just to show the sort of the flow and the dynamic between elementary schools, which led to a balanced feeder system in the McNary area. One of the recommendations that we'll talk about here in a minute is also to deal with Kennedy Elementary School, because it has some unique issues associated with the boundary changes, but in general as well. So that's kind of the flow between a feeder system. I wanted to take McNary and just use that as an example. Now, we could go through each box, or I could open it up for any specific questions that you may have on any given box, any given change.
Are we starting with elementary?
Yeah, I think it would be great to start with the elementary schools, and then we can move into the middle and high, and then talk about changes between the feeder systems. So do we have any questions that you'd like to start
Mine's
with?
all on high school.
Any questions at the elementary level?
Okay. Director Kylo?
I'm assuming thank you. I'm assuming we're going to get to some discussion about Miller being at 133% and kind of staying there. Okay.
And as a matter of fact, now's the perfect time for that.
Great, let's do that.
That's a really great lead-in on that. So as we, again, iterative processes, week by week, one of the proposals was to alleviate Miller's overcrowding, current and in the future, by taking some high-density population areas and moving that area, this area basically here, into Lee. Okay? The net effect at Lee would have been changing its population significantly and significantly changing its SES status, poverty percentage as well. Also ELLs. Now Lee, when you look at Lee from a capacity standpoint, you say, hey, look, it's got plenty of room. But we also know Lee is our ELL hub for this entire area down here. So we move kids for ELL services into Lee. So that's important to know. There's also pre-K, preschool classrooms at Lee as well. So we took all that into account, several iterative processes, lots of public input on this. And the task force decided to leave Miller's boundaries as they currently are and to recommend adding a bond project at Miller to alleviate the crowding in the future. Some of the logic behind that was it would allow the students to stay, so it's a least disruptive approach. Miller is one of our smaller elementary schools in the Northeast Corridor, and so plussing it up to about a 500, 525 school would make sense for the future as well. And I'd turn it over to Adam and Adriana if you wanted to add any context to that whole experience with Miller and Lee.
Miller, this was the biggest conversation. This was the biggest argument because, to be honest with you, there was a split in the way that this was organized in terms of South versus in Sprague, and so that discussion point. Miller was actually being used as a chess piece to try to alleviate some of the other overcrowding and things of that nature. And when the North group heard about that, they came back and said, no, that doesn't work. And so it probably brought the process to a grinding halt for a couple of weeks, to be honest with you. Lee was very passionate about not losing a lot of their programs. Miller also became that piece of trying to change Sprague's makeup. And so it wasn't fair to the Miller students with the way that it was being used, to be honest with you. And Adriana, jump in if I'm misstating this. But the conversation point about the size of the school, and also my understanding is there's plenty of room to expand, which is one of the few areas that we do have that ability. It was also brought up that there might potentially be some funds that are available to do that. The recommendation is that you do that, but I would be honest with you, and I mentioned this last week, the task force is very passionate about this, in that Miller cannot go on without some kind of a capital project on it. But there was a lot of discussion. We spent weeks on Miller and Lee and Pringles. To be honest, it bled into that whole conversation. But ultimately, that's why we came with that recommendation.
And just to add, a little bit also. It became one of our target points when we came to the discussion about equity. When we went out to a Four Corners meeting, and we tossed around the idea of busing the kids and the students from Miller all the way up Lee and then potentially Sprague or South, there was very apparent anxiety for those families and those students. One, because of transportation issues, what would happen for before school activities, after school activities, families not being able to travel all the way out there. And some families didn't even know where Sprague was. And so one of the biggest things that we took from that meeting was the equity component and how fair that would be for those families to be bused clear out south.
Director Hine.
Do the numbers for Lee reflect the ELL and pre-K students?
They do reflect the ELL. The pre-K students, that was something that we knew internally where the locations were, and so as long as there was capacity in any of the iterative changes, it wasn't an issue. The pre-K programs, if we needed to move them, we would move them to make sure that we had enough capacity at Lee to serve the K-5 students through any boundary change. But with this recommendation, that isn't something that we have to take on as a district.
Thank you.
But to be fair, that was brought up on multiple occasions. So the task force understood the programmatic programs could be moved out of Lee if this was the decision that was being made.
Okay. So that's Miller, and we'll get into more detail about that as when we go through the additional recommendations, which was that one sheet that I passed out.
Okay. Are there other questions specific to elementary? Because I have a couple, but I want to. No? Okay. So back to the discussion about adding. Sorry, I have to get my bearing here. Adding Mary Iyer and Four Corners to South versus Sprague, because I know that was an ongoing discussion, and I really, really appreciate that the committee and the district went to the schools and spoke to the families. But I guess the question I have is, was there any discussion about maybe having one of them go to South and one potentially go to Sprague, because the numbers, the total population numbers for South and Sprague are very different, and we're talking about diversity and equity. But also, part of this ongoing conversation has been about diversifying our entire district. And if you look at the demographics of those schools, and this is not to say in any way that South does not want additional diversity, but we've been having an ongoing conversation about the very, very difference between the Sprague student body and the makeup of the demographics and that of all the rest of our schools. So I'm curious, throughout all this discussion, was there any talk about maybe having one of the two schools that we know that we have to adjust, one of the two going to Sprague, one to give Sprague a little more diversity, but also opportunities for those families at a very well supported school. This is elementary. Yeah, so I want to hear their.
Yes, there was. There were many,
Okay.
many conversations.
So tell me a little bit more about how we got to the decision.
Well, so Adriana already touched on the some of the conversation that came from the Four Corners focus group.
Right.
Thank you. But I think we had multiple conversations about both aspects. This was the biggest discussion point of the entire task force, to be honest with you, was people trying to put more diversity into Sprague. A couple of points that were brought up were, unfortunately, Sprague doesn't have the current support systems with their their staff to be able to deal with many of the student population issues that are going to be brought into the school district. Adriana touched on a lot of those. If my child is sick, how am I going to go get that student? If I can't leave work, if they missed the bus, what are we going to do? There were those aspects coming from feedback from the parents. We had a lot of folks that know the makeup better than I, and they said, guess what? Sprague is just, the community's not ready for this integration. And I took that to heart, to be honest with you. But we also had the counter. If we don't force that now, when will we ever force that? But if you put all of those things together, because this was the thing that kept me awake, honestly. The biggest fight that we had over these conversations, because we weren't making any progress. There was a distinct faction that didn't like the negative impact they felt from South's numbers increasing, and then there was a faction that said, hey, we need to force this into Sprague. But to be honest with you, once we started talking about it, once we got over that roadblock, it just didn't make sense to do. Do you have any?
Yeah, I'll share with you one of the experiences from one of those conversations at Four Corners, and it brought a mother to tears. Just thinking about the anxiety of being in a very diverse school and community, and then having to all of a sudden pick up and go into a community that they're not a part of, that is completely out of their norm. And the mom's question was, if you want to diversify, why can't we bring Sprague families into our community? Why would we force, if we're really talking about equity, why would we put a burden on low-income families to then have to wake their kids up earlier than normal to bus them clear across town? What happens if they want to participate in before school activities and then after school activities, and then them having to ride the city bus, or parents having to make additional accommodations, versus why can't we put this on more affluent families and bus them to the north part of Salem? So the families were very reluctant to that idea, period. A lot of the families were more familiar with South and were more comfortable in going into South and the diversity that is already existent in South versus Sprague. It was like an unknown school.
So I do understand that, and again, I so much appreciate that we had those conversations, but so one thing I keep hearing is the greater distance in the busing, and I know that different people have said they've traveled the route, and if you go down I-5 and you cut over Kubler, it's basically the same, and so I know I've heard both. I've heard, but I guess I'm a little concerned that we continue to, I don't quite know how to say this, continue to keep one school very, very, very non-diverse, when the richness that all of our students and all of our families bring to a classroom and to a discussion and a community. So for me, it's wanting to balance the wishes of all of the families, but yet still feeling as though we have a little bit of segregation going on here.
So the traffic conversation was Cordon Road, and my response is, well, the Amazon Center hasn't been opened up yet, right? So it's a I mean, I live just down the road. Yeah. I'm not going to be able to drive that once that distribution center gets open. Using those as a bus route is not, it's not realistic. I mean, we need to, but from a diversity standpoint, we had members of the task force that were on the same boat, but we also had people that were realistic about it from a city of Salem property values, things of that nature. There's not a lot that's going to change that, short of forced. I guess I would put forth that the forced in history hasn't worked.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for providing that additional information and feedback.
And I can tell you that was one of the, I think, most challenging conversations about this whole process. It's how do we really diversify our our schools and start moving away from that segregation that we have. And
Right.
it wasn't just Sprague that
Right.
was brought into the conversations, it was also West.
Sure.
And it was very, very challenging because it meant putting a burden on our lower income families in order to diversify those schools. And is that really fair? And is that really equity?
But we are asking to move, we're asking them to make a change either way. One is just more dramatic
Yes.
than the other, so, okay, thank you.
And before we move on, just a point of clarification. We did have transportation take a look at the net effect of busing from Four Corners and Air to Sprague, and it's not as simple as getting in your car and going from point A to point B with a stopwatch. There's a whole routing system. It's not just the high school buses, it's the middle school buses, and it would have added significant travel time, which was one of the reasons that we took into account, just like the walk zones and keeping them intact. It was try to stay away from excessive bus times to the greatest extent possible, which was part of the West conversation as well, what that would have taken to actually bus students across the bridge and back.
I actually agree with the task force's recommendation. I actually live less than a block away from Miller, right? And so I was thinking to myself the other day, I was like, man, when I have kids, I'm not gonna want my kids to have to be shipped across town just to go to school for diversity's sake, you know? And if we're talking about equity, equity is, I mean, we're supposed to be meeting kids where they're at. We're not supposed to be shipping them to a different school just so that way they can be the token brown kids of a school. You know, that's not the goal. The goal is to help our students be successful. And so that's why I appreciate the fact that we're like, hey, let's keep the kids where we're at and let's just build up the schools so that way it's better. You know, we don't want to leave the community just for diversity's sake. We'd want our community, or the local community, to thrive without having to be being shipped across town. And I think that's what our community would want as well.
Director Green?
So this isn't just related to elementary, it's middle schools and high schools as well, and it's not in the glossary of terms, but we see it throughout, is the continuity exemption. Could you explain, just refresh my recollection as to what that is and what that says the school district will do for someone seeking a continuity exemption? Because it's not in the glossary of terms, but we've talked about it and we allow for it. So maybe Superintendent Perry or Mike, you want to remind us what that is?
Yes, I will, and as I'm doing that, I will also pass out a handout that will help in the conversation a bit. But as that's going around, so the continuity exemption we have in place is a process where you have to apply for it. But I'll start with elementary, then move to middle and high. So continuity exemption says that if you're a current third grader, so you'd be an incoming fourth grader, or you're a current fourth grader, you'd be an incoming fifth grader, when the boundary change takes effect, you can apply for a continuity exemption and it will be automatically approved so you can stay at your school.
At your attendance area school that
Yeah.
you were in?
Yep. But we do not provide transportation.
Okay.
So you might imagine that not every family would be able to take advantage of the continuity exemption without transportation. Okay? Similarly, at the middle school level, it would be incoming, so if you're a current seventh grader, you'd be an incoming eighth grader, continuity exemption would be available. And at the high school level, if you're an incoming junior or senior, you could apply for a continuity exemption. Does that make sense?
Sure. So I have another question for you then. And it could be a middle school, it could be an elementary school, it could be a high school. Let's say you are a family who is in a zone that is due to be reboundaried, and you have a student who meets that, but then you also have a first grader. And all of a sudden you would have a first grader going to his or her new elementary school and the fifth grader staying at their school. Is there the opportunity for that first grader to go where the fifth grader does, so we don't have parents running to two elementary schools and they know the principal, they know the staff, I mean, what's the process for that parent to say, I've got an incoming first grader and I want them to stay where my son or daughter is going to stay because of this continuity exemption? Same at the middle school, same at the high school. Do we have that process in place?
We do, and we deal with that all the time, and that's not the continuity exemption.
Right.
That's the in-district transfer process, and there is a criteria for approval, which would be sibling, keeping
Still
siblings
takes the two
together.
principal sign off, though?
Yes,
Yeah.
and part of what, I think so, yeah. Part of what one of the recommendations of the task force that we will need to get into a little bit more is what that can do is create an overcrowding situation
Right.
in any school. So we want to be mindful to the IDT process for the next 3 to 5 years as we implement these changes. And the answer may be no in the future, because there's not enough capacity available or given the projected enrollment at any given school.
I just want to make sure that we explain clearly to our parents what process is available for their students under a continuity exemption, and also for where they've got siblings that go, what is the process so that they don't have to run to 2 elementary schools, they don't have to run to 2 middle schools. Obviously, a high school feeder system is a little bit bigger. It's probably going to be more elementary and middle school, but I just want to make sure we clearly tell our parents what are the processes by which they could say, I want my siblings to go to the same school, even though I want my 4th grader or my 5th grader to stay at our current versus where we're being rebounded to, and I'd like my other son or daughter to follow their brother or sister as well. I want to make sure we explain that and that the processes are very clear so that they understand those, because that's the worst of all worlds for parents, trust me, as a parent, is trying to deliver 2 different kids to 2 different schools with band and track and all the other things that kids do. I want to make sure we have a pretty clear process so parents understand what is the process they need to go through to make sure that occurs.
And before we move on, the last large boundary change that we did in West Salem.
Right,
We did modify
right.
and extend to.
I was on the board when we did that.
If you're currently attending a school, you can stay. At some point, you have to stop because
Right.
there's future kinders on the way. You know, it's not a legacy issue, but there does have to be a go, no-go point in the future.
I do want to clarify, though, not all inter-district transfers are an automatic approval just because of the sibling.
No, in fact.
I mean, there is
Right.
that process.
Yeah.
But
It's not a
if-
guarantee.
Because if we have a school that's already 110 over capacity, to have that, there will be places we'll say no, because that is part of the problem we got into in West Salem.
It is, yeah.
But I want to make sure we're very clear about that with parents.
Okay. Director Hein?
I might have missed it. What's the difference between a standard and modified continuity exemption?
So that, yes, now, let's get into that a little bit, and I want to orient you to this document, and then we can talk about one of the recommendations that the task force made with respect to continuity exemption. So, when you look at this document, look at Table 1, the assumption is that we have continuity exemptions where transportation is provided, okay? That's table number 1. And so when you look at the standard continuity exemption for elementary, that's as I stated it. So if you take a look at Chavez, because of the boundary change, Chavez would be expecting 61 additional students with the standard continuity exemption, which means if you're a current 3rd or 4th grader, you would be eligible for the continuity exemption because you would be an incoming 4th or 5th grader, right, to stay at your school and not go to Chavez, right? We would provide transportation, so it changes the continuity exemption by definition because we don't provide transportation for continuity exemptions. But as staff work to follow up from the task force recommendation, we ran these numbers so you could see what it would look like, the impact of the schools that would be impacted if in a traditional continuity exemption with transportation. The modified continuity exemption that you see at the middle and the high school level, still at table 1, first half of the sheet, is essentially if you're, whatever school you're at, middle or high, you stay there and we transport you until you're done. The boundary change would only go into effect for incoming sixth graders for middle schools and incoming freshmen for high schools. So you can see the difference. Let's take South as an example. The standard continuity exemption with transportation means that there would be about 303 students heading to South. The modified continuity exemption, which basically says only incoming freshmen will be going to South with the boundary change, reduces that to 155. If you stay at the right column, right, the high school column with the modified, and you go down to table 2, that's without transportation. You can see the difference in the numbers, traditional continuity exemption and modified without transportation. So in other words, South without transportation, the traditional continuity exemption, they'd be receiving over 440 students. With the modified, almost 370. So you can see how adding transportation to the continuity exemption and modifying it at the middle and high school levels significantly impacts and reduces the amount of students that would be shifting next year. Okay, any questions on that? It's kind of hard to read, but hopefully we got that.
Okay. Director Hein?
Are these numbers at all reflected in the task force recommendation as far as the continuity without transportation specifically?
Yeah. Well, what we had provided was, no, that we wouldn't have taken the continuity exemptions into account. I mean, it would have been the
They
traditional
don't have
continuity
to.
exemption
They
with no
they don't have
transportation.
to stay in the, I mean, if a Washington Elementary
Right.
student was a fourth grader, and I don't know what's happening with Washington, I'm just using it as an example, they wouldn't have to stay at Washington. They could move to the new elementary school that would be in their boundary if they wanted, right? The continuation, or the continuity is just if they want to stay, they can. So if our recommendation is based on, it's probably not based on the number of students that might take advantage of continuity.
Yeah, just the projection was just the regular process, you know, and so the other piece I would say is the recommendation that we're looking at is modifying at the secondary level. So in other words, if whatever school you're at today is the school you stay at because of the boundary change. If you want to go to a different school, that wouldn't be a continuity exemption. That would fall into an IDT.
District transfer.
So we have to keep those two processes.
Whatever
Separate.
school you're at today, or do you really mean tomorrow? Like whenever the boundary changes are
Well-
agreed on? Because Mackay is already so overcrowded. If those students are going to stay through the rest of their high school years,
So let's tell you our thinking behind why there's a modified kind of a rolling boundary change process. So if you think about just North, for example, North will be under construction in 1920, and with transportation and without modifying the continuity exemption, they can get 413 more kids in 1920 when they're under construction. If we can slow the shift down just a little bit, it allows us to get North constructed, and then another wave of kids come in. And the other school that comes under construction next is South. And so in 2021, South will be under construction. And to only have 2 grades where the boundary change affects, it doesn't give the full effect of the boundary change, but it slows down the flow into schools that are going to be under construction. But it also doesn't, it slows down how soon we can take care of overcrowding for Mackay.
right? And what we have going on in Mackay is critical.
Yeah.
It can't wait another 2 or 3 years.
Well, this, you don't see this on any of these charts, but this also by implementing the boundary change with incoming freshmen only at North and South, it does provide some relief to Mackay, about 120 less students. So that keeps Mackay at around 2,400, as opposed to the trajectory that they're on without a boundary change to be close to 2,800 in less than 6 years. So it doesn't completely, Mackay won't feel the full effect of the boundary change, but that's the process that Superintendent Perry was just talking about, was mitigating the full effect in 2019, and so that we can get some of the additional capacity built and then take on the full boundary change, which it'll be in its second year. So now you'll really start to see the students that will begin to populate the schools. Remember, it takes a good 3 to 5 years for a boundary change to be implemented. And if you think about it, at the elementary level, that's 6 grades, that's 6 years. The middle school, that's 3, and at the high school, that's 4. So yes, there would be an impact at Mackay, but it would be a positive impact. There would actually be less students projected because of this. So we can get you the specific numbers. Well,
You're going to move on to middles?
Sure. We can move on to middle and high, and then we can go right back to these documents and finish up with the task force additional recommendations, which we've already touched on a bit. So again, you'll see at the middle school level, one of the areas that we wanted to balance was between Claggett and Whitaker in the McNary feeder system, and so this does that. There was more capacity at Whitaker, and Claggett was projected to be overcrowded, so this shift does that. We also looked at making some shifts between Stevens and Waldo, and so that's what these do. There is a minor change in West Salem between Myers Elementary and Calapooia, but no change between middle schools in West Salem, so you don't see any changes here. What we do see is shifting some from the split between Judson. Judson is split between Sprague and South, and so this changes that a little bit and makes it a more kind of balanced split between the two. One of the difficulties we have in our district is our typical feeder systems, high school, 2 middle schools, and then a series of elementary schools. We have 6 high schools and 11 middle schools, not 12 middle schools. So by definition, there will be some middle schools that are split between high school feeder systems. And you see that in Judson in particular. Okay? Any questions on the middle schools?
So looking at the Sprague feeder system, the Judson Crossler, that doesn't change their high school, though. It doesn't look like when I look at the high school map. Those students that were at Crossler that would be going to Judson, that was always part of Judson that went to Sprague.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And what about the Waldo Middle School to Stevens Middle School? They would still be in the Mackay attendance boundaries, correct? If I'm looking at it right, Mike.
Oh,
Well, no, there's a split between Mackay and North.
In that number 16 box?
No, the 16 stays in.
Actually, I think it's this box here. We've got from Stevens to Waldo.
It's that one down the, okay, it's 15,
15,
14,
14, and 8, yeah.
Okay.
Because again, Waldo is
It's a split.
currently not split.
Right.
It all feeds into Mackay.
right,
But Waldo will now be split
north, okay.
65% to Mackay and 35 to North.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
So that is a shift. I will say one of the things that the task force was able to rectify at the middle school level was currently parish is a triple split. And now it will all feed into North. So currently parish splits 10% of the population to Mackay, 70% to North, and 20% to South. now all the students will go to North, which they can see across the railroad tracks.
Yeah, again, I just want to thank you guys for that, just because, I mean, I'm sure that'll save a lot of families a lot of stress, you know, and make things a lot more stable, so thank you.
Any other questions at the middle school level? High school level? So, yes, come in.
Director Hein.
You raised first. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm on it.
He's on it.
Alrighty, so I had a few thoughts on the high school level, because especially when we're looking at the capacity of Sprague, it looks like it ends in 2027 at 85.2%. So they got plenty of room from what it looks like. I'm not sure if it's the same thing with us language as before. But looking at it, I saw that Sprague splits Judson with South. Is that right? So why don't we just have all of Judson go to Sprague and clear up a little bit of room for South? And then you see where Halk Middle School, like that's just such a weird like island to drive all the way to North. Yeah, so on the other map where it's green. Yes, that whole big green area right there. Yeah, so if we had, because that's half of Halk. So if you had half of Halk go to South, and then Judson go to Sprague, and then North, instead of driving kids all the way from out on the side of town, they could just take a little bit of from Leslie, which is just south of North High School, North Salem High School.
Okay,
Do you see what I mean?
I do. We've had a task force that has been working for months on this. And
Yeah.
we've looked at all of that. And so to answer why this is part of North, I think we have to go back in time a little bit. One of the things that is very important to the North community is that North doesn't become completely an inner city high school. And so it was important to have that reach out into the rural community. And that was brought up during the task force. And that work group that was focused in this area took a hard look at that. And so that's why you see it the way that you see, North stretching way out here, for sure. One of the ways to adjust the populations, because remember, we did look at, it wasn't just, as Adriana has said, how do we move a certain, this group of students south. It's, well, what happened if we did this, right? The way you move students is either through entire schools moving, like for instance, Washington now moves into North. It feeds into Waldo, but it moves into North. Holman into North, right? You can take whole schools. Or you take parts of schools at the middle school level, which is Halk. And Halk is about a 50-50 split between North and South. So that's sort of how students are shifted out of Mackay into North, out of North into South. Because when you move students from Mackay, right, where are those students? What's the trajectory of those students? What's the movement? We can't go north because the McNary feeder system's already full with, its student population. We looked at options to go west logistically, and for all the reasons that we talked about with respect to moving students to Sprague, that didn't make sense. So you're really looking at moving students from Mackay into North, students out of North so that they can receive the Mackay students into South, right? And that's kind of how the flow of students through this process has really sort of moved.
Okay, no, that's understandable. So mainly just North just didn't want to be an inner city school. And if that's the case, then I'm okay with that. I was wondering though, still, at Judson, why don't we have more of Judson go into Sprague?
So the conversation about Sprague that we just had in terms of equity and free and reduced lunch and everything else was talked about specifically about South. If we were to move the elementary schools that feed into Judson over to Sprague, the disparity would become significantly greater in terms of a 20% increase in free and reduced lunch for South and a decrease for Sprague. Because the schools that currently go, the elementary schools that go into Judson, that go to South, are the more economically, yeah.
Oh. So it's more based off of reduced lunch and income?
There were two aspects to every single thing that we reviewed. The first and foremost was the school size, but then the second one was free and reduced lunch, special education, and English as a English language learners. And moving that population was actually part of the springboard, if I recall.
It was.
And it was resoundingly argued against, and for valid reasons. So that's why we chose not to do that.
So I wanted to comment on that just real quick, and I do appreciate that. So it's not just the free and reduced lunch population, it's the abilities of some of our families and some not, ability to provide those additional supports to our schools. And so the couple of feeder schools that you remained at South do help provide additional supports. So South is not a title school, but it does have a high free and reduced lunch population, but those families do provide some additional supports for programs. So I appreciate that was recognized, because that will give some offset to the proposed change. So, yeah.
The conversation about the strength of the parent clubs is an example.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah,
you're talking
the booster
about.
clubs
The booster
thing.
clubs, things of that nature.
Yeah.
That came up quite frequently with that proposal. And that was one of the reasons that the decision was made to not make any changes to the elementary schools, which then translated into the middle schools.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense.
Director Hein?
So I didn't realize it was going to take 3 to 5 years for the boundary change process to be done. I must have missed that information. So speaking of Mackay and also North, I think it's pretty clear from the numbers that Northeast Salem has the highest levels of poverty in the city. They have the highest levels free and reduced lunch, et cetera. When you look at the totals for 2027, you look at Sprague and West Salem, which are both in the 80s, and then you look at the remainder of the schools that are in the 90s, and of course, 100 for McNary. I'm wondering if it would be better if the boundary change another boundary change may not make sense. And I agree, I don't want to bus kids over to West Salem. But looking at the bond, which unfortunately ties into this, and the number of things that are going into West Salem versus some of the other schools, would it be more equitable to increase the bond pieces for more classrooms, maybe at North and Mackay, where they're going to have a higher percentage of students? So, and that would also include South, because they're going to be pretty high. Because, there's a lot of Section 8 housing. I don't see them building Section 8 housing over by Sprague. I just don't see it. And that usually comes with more children. So these numbers, I know we're using the Portland University numbers, but I don't know that they're really going to be very accurate. I think we're going to run out of space right away. In fact, I'm really concerned because I thought we were going to have some alleviation of space issues at Mackay next year. That's what I was telling people. Look, it's going to be better next year. It's really not going to be better enough that anybody's going to notice.
Well, again, we're looking at over 100 less students at Mackay, so that there will be an impact. What you won't see is the removal of the portables. I mean, you won't see that until the new addition is put on, and that won't be in effect until 2022.
But the way the boundaries are recommended right now, the result, because of where we're spending bond money, and I know there are two issues, but yet they're tied together, there's still a lot of inequities. And I would like to look at where we're spending all the bond money so that we have a more equal distribution of our students and the capacity at the schools they go to. Do you understand what I'm saying?
So I want to just make two comments. One is the reason we started at McNary and North was because we knew we had to build up capacity in order to handle the change, and we did know that would take time. So that's why we started there instead of at Mackay. So the goal is relieve some build up, relieve some crowding, relieve some more crowding as you build up, move into the next area. And purposefully, we kept the West Salem and Sprague build outs for the end because we knew the crowding had to be relieved in the northeast feeder area first. And any recommendation around changing of bond funds ultimately can come to the Citizens Advisory Task Force and then back to the board. But that we did start purposefully in that kind of north area in part because we know that's where the crowding is. And we put those two projects at the end because we knew that was not where the crowding was. And then the other thing I want to say is in the projections, we used Portland State, but we also used Flow Analytics, and they went through every parcel in the community and assessed all the building permits, the plans for those areas. So Portland State is a pretty high level, and then Flow Analytics got down deeper into the weeds on the actual building permits and what was projected to be on land. And they, I think, have projected out until the all the property within the urban renewal area is built out. And on the places where it was multifamily and affordable multifamily units, they actually gave us a higher percentage of students that are in those complexes than what would be normal in the Portland metro area because they were seeing that trend that we have more families percentage-wise. So they've taken in a few additional factors beyond what the Portland State study did. So Flow Analytics data is what you see in these projections. We will still have the crowding and the enrollment growth in the Northeast, across the Northeast.
Right, because even aside from the new apartments or whatever, I mean, in my neighborhood, there's frequently more than one family in one single-family home.
Correct.
And you can tell by the number of cars. I know that doesn't reflect on how many kids there are, but that's more likely to increase the number of children going into the school.
Correct.
So I'm just really concerned about Mackay and the overcrowding and alleviating some of this as soon as possible.
Yeah,
and
we are
making
too.
sure that they're not right at the top all the time where these other schools are got lots of room. It's trying to make it a little more equitable.
Yeah, we agree.
I guess I'm raising my hand so I can call on myself. So on that same note, and I know we're kind of jumping ahead to high schools, but the discussion of our high schools and our middle schools who are seeing a shift in an increase in the number of students or a shift in the number of free and reduced lunch or English language learners or whatever it may be. I was kind of surprised that we didn't see a recommendation from the task force with regards to looking at how we budget resources. So aside from capacity, and I know that you're a big fan of needs-based budgeting, but I think for us as a school board and then a budget committee, whatever it is we end up our final, approval, there are some of our schools that are going to be additionally impacted, and I will be advocating for a special look at resources for whether it's counselors or advisors or whatever that additional support may be, in part because some of the schools that they may be coming from, they may have those resources because they may be a Title I school. But now if they're shifting to South, that's not a Title I school and doesn't have those built-in resources, I want us to be taking a close look at those resources. So I was hoping to see a recommendation to that effect, and I kind of would like to see that added.
Actually, we kept the task force out of
Okay.
budget
Okay.
and out of program reviews.
Right.
Because we have a budget committee process.
Okay.
And we have Superintendent Perry's budget message.
Yeah.
And proposed budget that is under development. So
Right.
We just, it's not their fault, it's my fault.
Not from lack of trying. No, not from lack of trying.
Tried, okay,
There
good.
were a number of opportunities.
I'm glad to hear that, because we do have a recommendation to add additional bond projects, so we're talking about adding more money to this, so I was, again, we're asking for more bond dollars, but, yeah.
Right.
And that was, I think, part of the conversations continually with the task force. It was really asking questions about programs and support systems that one school has, that one school might not have. So it was brought up numerous times. And so
I'll just make a
I'm
little note on the bottom.
Yeah.
Recommended by.
Yeah. The other thing that we talked about is the difference between an overcrowded school and an overcrowded classroom. And this bond or the boundary process isn't about adjusting class size. That's a staffing issue. It's about making sure there's enough space to accommodate the students in the future. Yes, and we have some other.
I just want to, again, go into how much I appreciate the work you guys did. I mean, when we're looking at elementary schools, as long as we're building on Miller, I mean, it looks great. The work looks great. Middle schools, same thing. With the high schools, I know that we all agree that things need to be equitable, and that we all agree that Sprague and West have more room than everybody else, and we all agree that West is kind of over a river and through the woods, and nobody from North wants to go over there because they'd rather just go to their own school. I think we can all agree to that. The one part that's bothering me looking at this is how Sprague, even though it's just right there, is still so much under capacity, whereas we've got the same problems as we've usually had. Mary's at 100, just over 100. We got South Salem right at 100. I mean, we got all the same schools that we're already worrying about and talking about, still going to have the same issues in so many years. And so I want to make sure that we're planning in a way to where we can kind of make things more equitable. It looks like Sprague's going to stay just about the same way it is, which is great. Sprague's a great school. I'm not meaning to demean anybody at all. I'm just saying that without saying that, hey, we need to ship kids because of their skin color or because of their economic background. The reason I'm saying it isn't just because of that. It's because of capacity and having kids be able to have a relationship with their teacher. Mm-hmm. It's because not being in a super crowded school. That's the reason I'm concerned about it. And so I don't want kids shipped from Houck or Miller over where I live all the way to Sprague. That wouldn't even make sense. But there's got to be something that we can do with Sprague and South or North or whatever it is to make it a little bit more even, to take some pressure off of Mackay North.
I appreciate that. And the other thing that we talked about a lot in the task force is these projections take us out 10 years, because that's about as far as you can reasonably look, given the funding sources and all that. And so 10 years this isn't a 20-year solution. Okay? When people ask, gee, is this the last bond? The answer is likely no, because we're a growing district, right?
Can't afford another one.
This bond and this boundary change isn't intended to go 15, 20 years. In 10 years, someone else is going to be standing up in front of this group talking about the need for the next bond and the shift in population demographics. So there's part of the context here. This is really, we're using 2017 numbers, and we're looking out 10 years.
Well, can you guys go into a little bit of detail about how, because I know you guys aren't. I know you guys are really smart and you did things with the best that you can. I think you guys did a great job. With Sprague, can you go into kind of the reasons of why we didn't shift, for example, a little bit north of Sprague, like this area, into Sprague, or why we didn't move more of, I understand the Judson part now, but why didn't we move what's north of the Sprague boundary? You see the part where it's all pointy? Like, just kind of why we didn't do certain things, just so that we can have a better understanding, the public can, as to why Sprague's where it's at with capacity, if that makes sense.
So we shared the exact same concerns, right?
Yeah.
Taking a look at this from an equity standpoint, we look at West's numbers and we look at Sprague's numbers, and it is crunching to look how under capacity they're going to be versus, again, Mackay and North. But I think one of the main reasons that we keep going back to is that this is really a housing issue. we don't have affordable housing up south. We don't have affordable housing up west. And our lower income middle class families are concentrated in the northeast side of town. And so, kind of like Mike said, we're in 10 years, we might be back here asking for another bond for maybe a new high school. I think one of the main reasons was, one, the socioeconomic numbers, where we don't want to all of a sudden split all of these more affluent families and put them all into Sprague, because we really want to level out south and make sure that we have that balance and not turn south into a Title I school. And then with west, there's not a lot of room that we can do, because that adds such a big burden to our families. And we had this conversation for a few weeks where we were thinking about busing the communities around Highland and Grant over the bridge into West Salem. And at first I was really pressing for that, and we took a look at transportation. But then when we went out to the community and we said, what do you think about this? The response was no. That why would we do that? Why would you make our families drive clear across the lake? And what happens with before school activities and band and orchestra and after school activities? And my kid would have to jump on a city bus because I can't go clear out there when North is right here. So I can tell you that for someone that is, one of my main passions is equity, and to really diversify our schools and to really offer all of our students equal access to opportunity. Looking at those numbers was very crunching for me, but at the same time, I made sure to really focus into what the families and what our community was saying.
So to jump on that, we did the little pointy part of south.
Sure.
We did move that into Sprague, and the listening session, it was the Candelaria, and they came out and they were very vocal against that. And it was one of those responses where, come on, guys, it makes sense. Why wouldn't you want to go to Sprague? I mean, it's closer. It's all this other stuff, and they were very vocal against that. You also have to look at the makeup of the city, and the reality of the situation is Sprague in 10 years, according to this, and based on the permits that have been pulled and things of that nature, sure, it's at 86% or whatever the heck that number is. But where else are we building in Salem? That's where all the new homes are going to be. I think it's going to change that equity conversation more, because those are going to be expensive homes. But I think you're not going to see this number. It's going to be greater in terms of a population standpoint if people are truly moving into Salem with the intention of going to our schools, because there's nowhere else to build.
So I wanted to add, I appreciate what you brought up, and it's kind of circling back to what we started with, the conversation about South and bringing a couple of the elementary schools from the north, but yet still also wanting to retain some of our more involved families and schools. So Candelaria is a great example. Yes, they could have been moved. However, that school and those families are very, very active. They're very active at South, and to lose that school, but yet knowing that we're going to be at 103%. It's a balance, because they do provide some of those supports. So, yeah.
Thank you for that explanation, especially when you were talking about Candelaria and how they're choosing to go to South instead. That makes a lot more sense. And I guess if we portray that to the public, it would.
I'm just going to comment that the exact point you're arguing, I remember the day that Adriana was arguing that exact same point with us really hard and pushing us really hard on that. So she was the advocate for continuing to push us in directions to answer those exact questions.
Yeah, and I can tell you that we went, I think the Candelaria conversation, after we had one of the iterations up online, we heard a lot from that community in emails on really urging us to reconsider keeping those communities at South. Yeah.
So do we have other questions?
Any other questions at the high school level? I'd just make one more point. We had talked about not changing the McNary feeder system forever, right, even through the bond. The Boundary Task Force did, though, and it made sense along Kale Road here. There was one group of students, elementary students in particular, that would be receiving ELL services at Keizer Elementary over here. But Hammond is right here. And so for years, we've been IDTing this population of students to receive ELL services to Hammond. This fixes a long-term issue. And it also, there's a bunch of housing development here that will bring in to Mackay in the future. And these won't be low-income houses in this area. So that may help diversify Mackay a little bit in the future as well. But we did make a change to the McNary feeder system. Any Keizer people in the audience?
He's not listening.
Okay. All right. If there are no more questions, I'd like to then move to the additional task force recommendations, which we've kind of touched on a bit, but I want to make sure that we go through them because we will be asking for board approval next month. So if we start at the first bullet point, we're looking at additional capital construction projects at Kennedy and Miller. The staff response is that we concur, and we're looking at about an $8 million add at Miller and about a $3.5 million at Kennedy. One of the issues that we have at Kennedy, similar to Auburn, is that they have the most portable classrooms. They have 7 portable classrooms, and several of them are end of life, as we talked about in the bond. And so while the population at Kennedy doesn't look like it would warrant an addition, that's because we're taking into account within its capacity 7 additional portable classrooms. And Kennedy was one of those schools that was right on the bubble, just below the line when we had to size the bond at 619.7. And so it was a very, very important conversation for the task force. And very adamant, and the community input as well was, even though the population may not look like Kennedy needs some help, Kennedy needs some help. So that's why it's part of the recommendation. And just one more second. This is the interface between CBOC, Community Bond Oversight Committee, which Adriana is on as well. So we've got that transition between Boundary Task Force and CBOC. And at CBOC, we're having conversations, as you may remember, at our very first meeting, Director Hine and Lippold, where when we look at, remember the additional $65 million in premiums that we received when we went out to the bond market? We've got that set aside. That's not part of the base bond program. The base bond program is the 619.7. Of that $65 million, we're releasing $25 million to support implementation of the boundary recommendations. So you ask, where would that $11.5 million come from? It would come from the $25 million that we need to have the conversation with CBOC that would then roll back to you for final decision on releasing that money for additional projects. And with that, take any
I'm sorry,
questions?
Director Hine.
Okay, so I want to make sure I understand this. For Miller and Kennedy, we had a recommendation of some changes, and then it went to who that said yes to move forward? Nobody.
It hasn't
So
yet.
it's going to go to CBOC, which is what we're a part of,
Yep, Monday night.
and then they're going to make a recommendation, and then it'll go to the board if they want to proceed. So in regards to Mackay,
Right.
what would be the process for looking at additional classrooms or space for Mackay?
So
the same kind of process, or, you
Well, I
know?
think what we would need to do is probably have a more thorough conversation at the board to understand exactly what you're proposing, because the way that we've sized this is we've sized our high schools generally at 2,200. That decision has already been made. It was made by the Facilities Task Force and approved by the,
Right.
by the
Right.
board and the community with the bond. So we're not looking at programming any of our high schools to be 23 or 2,400 capacity. They're at 2,200. So when you say add additional classrooms, I'm not exactly sure how that would fit in to the underpinnings of the bond. Now, if there may be some other areas that we could look at, like for instance, there may be some elementary schools, and I'll get into this in just a second, additional elementary schools that because of the bond or because of the boundary changes, maybe like at an Air, there's more kids shifting to Mary Air than we had originally anticipated when we scoped the project for the bond. I think we still need to, we know that there's 3 schools, Mary Air, Grant, and Houck, that we need to have those conversations with the board around potentially additional scoping, additional classrooms. You can have those conversations to the extent that you need to have them at the board. Just saying at the high school level, the decision was made at 2,200. Once the high schools in 10 or 12 years are at or over that capacity, I think that's a different conversation for the community, which could be another high school, as opposed to the next iteration of plussing up all of our high schools to 2,500. So to answer your question about Mackay, I think that we just need to understand a little more about what it is that would be helpful.
And remember also that we haven't even started design at Mackay yet. That comes as soon as we launch North and McNary in construction, then we begin the design work at Mackay. So it's we'll be back to you quite a bit with information along the way, and at CBOC as well. So you'll have 2 entry points to really watch what happens with Mackay. And so keep asking the question.
So just to add to what Director Hein is saying, and again, this is the balance, South is looking at, so Mackay would be at 2270, but South is going to be at 2330. But we have to balance the need to shift 2 elementary schools that come with 150 students that we've been discussing. So, but we also recognize that we don't necessarily want to move those 150 students to a different high school other than South. So South is going to be, instead of at 2,200, they're going to be at 2,300, 2,330.
In 5 years, declining in the next
Yeah.
5 years to right at its
Yeah, at
capacity.
2022, South will be at 2,331 versus 2,200, which, you could say, okay, let's not move those two elementary schools, and we would be right at 2,200. But we understand the need of where those students and those families need to go. So that's where we are.
So
Dr.
Mike,
Green?
you've kind of already teed this up. I'm assuming out of that 25 million, you got 11.5 million for Kennedy and Miller. The other 13.5 million must be Iyer, Grant, and Houck, the last recommendation that you've got there?
We don't know yet, but I doubt very soon. I mean, we haven't finished the scoping. We need to
Right.
get in based on these numbers and do a deeper dive. But the first 2 that are critical are Miller and Kennedy.
Right.
I wouldn't see the other 3 that we're talking about at 13 million. Yeah, so but know that out of the 25, that gives the board flexibility on adjusting.
So the 25 was not pulled out just to address boundary discussions. There's other things that you're going to bring to the board yet?
Well, the 25 was additional to the base
Right.
program.
I got it.
But primarily, right now, we're talking about what it would take to implement the boundary adjustments.
Okay.
Yeah, it may not take the full 25. Our goal is that it wouldn't. And then we would have, that would just roll back probably into insurance policy.
Contingency
Yeah.
for cost
Escalation.
increases.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. One of the things we want to be careful about, I don't want to get into too much of a bond conversation, is not to add too much too early, because we've got a big program to
escalation.
deliver. Yeah, absolutely. Okay? So the next recommendation is around the existing continuity exemptions. And basically, to implement, so the first blue bullet response, staff response, just to implement the boundary changes with existing continuity exemptions with no transportation, okay? Just to implement, not providing any transportation, would take 10 buses. And the associated staff support package for a total cost of approximately $2.25 million. That's just to make the boundary changes work. For an additional $0.25 million, $250,000, we can add 2 more buses and provide transportation to all students affected by the boundary change. So we would be able to provide transportation for those, for the continuity exemptions. That includes the modified continuity exemption, which adds the other year that we were talking about. So everything that we've discussed with respect to traditional and modified continuity exemptions with transportation, also at the high school level, primarily at Mackay, North and South, would mean that if you're a freshman today in those schools, you would stay at those schools, and we would continue to transport you there, obviously. And for incoming 6th graders at Waldo and Stevens. And the continuity exemptions, we would provide transportation for all the other schools that are affected by the boundary change as well. So it's a $2.5 million package to support that.
So the question I have, is that total cost to us, or is that cost, so I guess is that with or without the transportation grant reimbursement, Mike?
That's total cost.
So we would see a 70% reimbursement
The
from the
general
state.
fund would receive 70%.
So
Yep.
the total cost to us, it really isn't 2.5 million.
That's the initial outlay.
That's the initial outlay with a 70% reimbursement from the transportation.
Right, but the biggest part of that would be the buses, and you don't get this, as you know, you don't
You
get
get
the
to depreciate
70%
you
all
get a
in 1 year,
depreciation of them. So-
over a 10-year period.
So it's not totally at 2.5 million. It's, Michael Shields could tell us what it is with the depreciation of the 12 buses and the increased mileage, but it's going to be less than 2.5 million.
The net effect over time to the general fund will be less than
Okay.
2.5 million, absolutely.
I want to make a comment too, because by providing transportation, it helps our families that it would be hardest to have a continuity exemption. But at the same time, when you provide transportation, it slows down that implementation of the bound. That's why it takes 3 to 5 years. So on one hand, you're doing the right thing for families who are most affected to stay in their school. But on the other hand, it really makes that 3 to 5 year boundary change process till fully implemented. So it's a catch-22, but one of the recommendations from the task force was, and we heard loud and clear, is a continuity exemption for some families is not an option without transportation. Even for kids who would be a senior in high school, a continuity exemption's not an option unless we transport. So it's a tricky balance on that one.
And before we move off of that, for a future board meeting, just as a heads up, sort of a primer for the conversation, the 12 buses, typically it takes 9+ months to build a bus from production, right? We would need these buses now, and so would likely be a contingency request to the board, because we have to go and purchase existing stock, and that means you've got to lock those assets in, because you don't have 9 months to get it into a production queue. So that's just a follow-on for the board, probably in February. Okay. All right. The third staff bullet here, staff recommendation, is basically modifying for only incoming sixth graders at Stevens and Waldo and only incoming ninth graders at Mackay, McNary North and South, as we've discussed. On the back side, so again, we're talking about reviewing and adjusting the current IDT transfer process, guidelines, and communications, which again, to your point, Director Green, is to be very transparent and very clear with our parents so they understand the differences between continuity exemption, what we're providing as far as transportation, and an IDT. Our response is to include projected student enrollment and building capacity in the approval process to ensure that we avoid overcrowding our schools. And so, in essence, as Superintendent Perry said, when decisions are made about approving IDTs, I think it is important to try and provide as much continuity with families as possible. We also have to take into account, is there room for that to happen? And not just in 1 year, but over the long term. So that's what this is talking about. Conduct a final staff review, proposed boundary changes, again, with the transportation, taking a look at this. So real quick, on your maps, you see boxes that have alpha, right, A through H. These are specific cul-de-sacs or a shift between one property and another that transportation took a look at. There are 8 changes, A through H, through here, and you can see, kind of where they're located. They affect 9 students total, and so many of them don't affect any students, but it is just adjusting. Sometimes there's a vacant lot and the property line goes right through the middle. Well, that's not going to work if housing development goes in or an apartment complex. So those adjustments were made. There is one, it's C, which affects Englewood to Hoover. There's actually 7 students affected there. And so we're going to reach out and take another hard look at that to make sure that that makes the most sense to do that. But in a lot of cases, what this has done is reduce routes, travel time, and reduce the number from 212. It would have been slightly higher, the number of buses, if we didn't make these changes based on transportation's review. And I think that takes us to the last bullet statement, which is identify any additional investments needed to fully implement the task force recommendations. And that's where we are introducing AIR, grant, and HAUC as potential projects in the future that would be part of that $25 million that we had talked about. There may be some others as we get into this. That's why the task force kept this recommendation kind of open-ended, just to make sure that as we get in, could be additional program resources, could be lots of things as we move forward. But it's on us to identify whatever's necessary to implement the boundary changes. With that, I think we've covered the specific changes, school by school, by level, by feeder system, and the additional recommendations that the task force made with staff input. Any questions?
I was thinking that after we shift to the public hearing and we hear a comment, if there are any comments that raise questions for us, if we have an opportunity to either circle back and ask a clarifying question after public comment when we do the reading, because we'll have the reading of the recommendation and then we have another opportunity for discussion. So if there's anything that we hear that we want to follow up on, maybe we can do that at the first reading.
Yep, sounds great.
First reading. Okay.
You can do it first and second reading. So first reading tonight, you'll have another opportunity in February to ask questions.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you and Adrienne and Adam as well. Another night. Thank you both. Appreciate it. And with that, I think we're done.
Okay. Well, thank you both. So we are going to transition. I think we'll just take a 5-minute break. We were talking about trying to restructure the room, but we're not going to do that. And we don't have a lot of folks. We only have 4 folks signed up for public comment. So those that are signed up, if you're comfortable kind of coming up to
Right
this
where
area.
Adam is.
Yeah, and you can have a seat or you can stand, whatever you're most comfortable. We want you to feel comfortable and welcome, but we don't want to have to completely break down the room and restructure it because that'll take 15 to 20 minutes. So we're going to take a 5-minute break.
So 7:15, right? Is that, no, that's not it at all. 7:35.
7:35. Thank you. We're going to reconvene the January 22nd Salem-Keizer School Board, and we are going to start with public comment. So we have 4 individuals signed up, and it looks like all 4 are related to the boundary. And so we are going to ask you if you're comfortable, if you'd like to come up and have a seat where Adam was sitting. So we're going to start out with Tanya Garcia, and we'd ask that when you come, you state your name for the record and your city for the record.
Are we keeping track of time?
Yes. So my apologies. We do allow for 3 minutes of public comment. And Alice will be operating the clock, and so right there. Okay. So thank you.
My name is Tana Garcia, and I live in Salem. My perspective could be considered unique as I live in West Salem. Our son graduated from West in 2015, and I teach at Mackay High School, and our daughter graduated from there last year. When I look at the current boundary proposal, here's what stands out to me. If the projections are accurate, in 2022, only 3 years from now, Mackay will be 39 students under capacity, and West Salem High School will be 363 students under capacity. Mackay is currently hundreds over capacity, and the daily impact is felt acutely by staff and students. Our building was built in 1978. West was built in 2002. West is receiving bond money, not just for maintenance, but for what appears to be desires, such as 20 new classrooms. Mackay is also receiving bond money for maintenance and additions. Mackay will be adding classrooms to our main building, but losing 22 classrooms by eliminating our outbuildings in the portable and annex. So after the bond build, Mackay will actually be losing 11 classrooms. When I look at the proposed boundary adjustment, it appears to me that West is receiving bond money for unnecessary remodeling, but receiving no new students. The common messaging from the district is that the bond and boundary adjustment proposal are 2 separate issues. How can that be when building capacity projections are based upon school improvements and expansions made possible by the bond? Even if unofficial, the consistent messaging from the district has been that boundary adjustments to alleviate overcrowding would be done after the bond was passed, so improvements could be made in schools enlarged to receive the additional students. Therefore, I absolutely reject that the bond money and boundary adjustment are separate issues, and that was reaffirmed, I think, at our meeting today. I have been told one reason the district doesn't want to expand West boundaries is it would contribute to increased traffic across the bridge. Are we really against providing equity in education because it will add a few buses and student cars to the bridge during rush hour? I cross that bridge every day. My daughter crossed that bridge every day, and it is inconvenient, but it is not unmanageable. I find it interesting that we are willing to bus our newcomer students to north from West Salem, yet are unwilling to bus students from north to west because it might create a little more traffic congestion. According to the boundary adjustment representative from the task force, families surveyed around Mackay requested that equity and diversity be honored and reflected in the decisions made. When asked how they would measure if they had honored that request, the response was the task force thought about equity and diversity when making the boundary adjustments. When I look at the demographics of West Salem High School and Mackay High School before and after the proposed boundary adjustment, what it looks like is that the task force interpreted the request as maintaining and containing diversity to certain schools. When we do that, everyone loses. My son would come home from West and share how the lack of diverse perspectives often meant a lack of empathy for alternative perspectives and often being the only one with his perspective. I stand before you today, or sit, I guess, saying that it is not right and it isn't equitable. Mackay should be receiving extensively more funding because we are grossly overpopulated with a very old building. Since it seems too late to change bond money distribution, I request that you insist that the task force adjust west boundary lines as well. If the current proposal goes through, Mackay will very likely be over capacity in just a few years, if not immediately, while beautiful palatial West High School will still be hundreds of students under capacity. And I ask you, what message does that send to our families and students? I get that equity and integration are not easy. It requires building capacity in our staff, in our students, and in our community. But it is the right thing to do.
So Tanya, I'm
almost done.
Well, your time is up. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to argue that it's worth it, and I think that we need to educate the communities and think creatively, because I
Okay.
do get that the families are fearful about that.
Thank you. I appreciate your testimony. Okay. So next is Jesse Garcia.
Hello, I am Jessie Garcia, and I live on 1814 Tarwigan Street, Salem, Oregon. I graduated from Mackay High School last year. I loved my school's diversity and the sense of community. However, it is evident that Mackay is grossly overcrowded, which directly affects the learning climate and the education the students receive. Some of the challenges at attending an overcrowded school are: it takes forever to get your lunch in the lunch line, and you have to spend your whole entire time waiting to get your lunch. There aren't enough seats in the cafeteria, so students have to go to classrooms. Students have to try to get to class early to make sure they have a seat because there aren't enough desks. Classroom sizes are so large, which impacts the amount of help students receive from their teachers. There aren't enough restrooms for the students, so you have to wait in long lines to use the restroom. Every single bit of space is utilized, and we've learned how to cope with a very challenging situation. Our orchestra room is a storage closet. Whatever decisions are made about boundary lines will directly impact the education students receive. Mackay needs more resources and a lot fewer students. If your goal is to provide an equal and equitable education, you will prioritize these two things, not temporarily, but for the long run. I also need to state that as an athlete, we would compete in schools like Sprague and West. Being in these schools that are much nicer with a lot more space for a lot fewer students made us feel deprived. These differences communicate to Mackay students that we aren't worth investing in. Mackay is known as the poor ghetto school, and West and Sprague are known as the rich white schools. I ask that when you are allocating the resources and thinking about boundary lines, that you will consider the things I have shared. You need to make a decision that is best for all students' education.
Thank you very much. Okay. Next up is Bob Garcia.
Hello, I'm Bob Garcia. I'm from Salem, Oregon. I just want to say thank you to everybody here on the board, because I know this is a very difficult issue, and to the task force that was recommending the changes to the boundaries. I know that there are a lot of difficult issues that are being addressed here. I was actually, some of the quotes that I wrote down was, the community is not ready for integration, or there's not a support network in place for some of the changes that are being asked for. Those are very difficult things, and I think it's going to require some brave and bold decisions by the board to work on integration and work on making sure that everybody has a fair and equitable chance to receive an education that's going to help them be successful. And I think right now where we are going, just from the impression that I had from listening to the conversations, it just seems that everything is being pushed down the road rather than being dealt with. And that is my concern as a citizen, is that we aren't ready to make the decisions that need to be made. I think there are going to have to be some hard decisions related to boundary moves, I personally am not satisfied with what I've seen, and especially with maybe the integration that would be taking place with the boundary moves. I'm also concerned about the fact that there was a separation of the budgeting, with the money coming from the bond being separated from the decision-making that was going on with the boundary changes. I think the two should have been integrated so that schools that were going to be overpopulated or are overpopulated right now are going to get some additional funding. And I think that needed to should have been involved in the process from the beginning. And I don't think it's fair to these schools that are going to be essentially probably still overpopulated, especially if they're capped at 2,200. We aren't seeing that right now. If you're looking at it with the information that is out there, these schools are overpopulated and they're going to need some additional funds to help these schools be successful. And the communities want to stay in those schools, so we need to make sure that they're getting the money to be successful. So those are my concerns. I know that it's, I don't envy you because I know you guys have a hard, you do one thing, people yell at you, you do another thing, people yell at you. But I know that we put you in this position so that you guys can make the hard decisions, and I hope you can. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And the last person signed up is Jillian is it Carney? Carrie. Thank you. Right. Thank you.
My name is Jillian Carey, and I live here in Salem, Oregon. I am here as a mother of an 8th grader who is moving to high school. We live in the Sprague district. I'm here as a special education teacher who teaches at Mackay High School in the LRC with one of the largest caseloads in our district. I'm also here as somebody who grew up and graduated from the Salem-Keizer School District and whose parents retired from the Salem-Keizer School District, so I'm highly invested. I think we've covered a lot of things. I think you've heard a lot. I really want you to think about equity versus equality. There's a difference. We are asking for equity for Mackay High School, not equality, which does not mean fun conversations for you guys, and that is why you're in these positions. I also travel to multiple classrooms at Mackay High School. I don't get to teach in my own classroom. I share rooms. I have to go through the passing time with the students, and I am never on time to my class. I teach until the bell rings. I grab my bag. I travel to my next class, and I'm oftentimes greeted by 23 to 28 special education students going, "Where have you been?" as I'm trying to fight my way through the traffic. My special ed students oftentimes don't eat because they're too embarrassed to stand in line or to say, "Hey, that's my spot," because there's so many kids in line, so they just don't eat. I want my son to know what diversity is. Therefore, we have been having some pretty big conversations in my home about him attending Mackay High School so that he can actually see what the world is like and not what South Salem is like. Please, please consider all of the needs in the community and be willing to have those hard conversations. I know they have to be had in order for us to have equity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so that is everyone that was signed up. We usually ask if there was anybody else who would like to speak to one of the agenda items. And although Chair Goss is not here, I know that she would thank you, each of you profusely for being willing to come and speak and to take your evening and come and share with us your thoughts. So thank you very, very much for the public comments. So next on the agenda is we are going to actually move into the reading of the bond. So this is a first reading. So it is with regards to the Boundary Review Task Force recommendation. So Superintendent Perry.
All right, in your board packet tonight, you have the recommendation with a little bit of background discussion. I think you heard in depth the proposed boundary changes and the additional task force recommendations. So at this point, I would just open it up for questions rather than to review any of the content that we had during the work session.
I'm sorry. Oh, Chair Kyla.
My question is, if we leave tonight, we come up with some grand, brilliant idea for alleviating some of the problems, say at Mackay, on a temporary basis, or to extend over 2 or 3 years, how would we present those? Would that be at the next reading? Or how would you want those handled?
Yeah.
Because an idea has been floating over here that might solve some of that problem without creating a huge disruption to what the boundary committee has proposed,
So-
which one of us was part of.
I think the best way to get that is let's get that to Mike and I, so we can kind of help vet the recommendation and come back with some responses to it. So we'd have a chance to do the research behind it.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Just
So,
wanted to know.
yeah, I would ask if we could provide that information as soon as possible so they can take a look at it and
Last minute.
thank you. I know you won't do that. Okay. Director Lippold?
I had a question. So I was just curious because I've never done a boundary thing before. This is my first time doing that. And so what would happen if theoretically we all voted no? Well, I'm not saying we would. I'm just saying if it happened, it's not like the bond where it just goes away.
sort of.
We still have to deal with it. So what would be the process if that happened?
Well, I would ask you if you all voted no to give us some direction.
Yeah.
Did you want us to go back to the task force? Did you want some additional staff work on the boundary changes? You will, at some point, you'll run into a timeline issue with actually making any boundary changes for next year. So the window's a little short. So I guess if there's a complete no vote, think in terms of what would your next steps be.
So I would
I'll
also,
pair that with a thank you for all the work you do. I'm not saying I'm going to. Just curious.
so I would
That's a good
ask
question.
that Mike Wolf just give us a quick reminder of how all of this fits into the timeline. I think that would be good for us to hear that again. What is the timeline that we're on?
Sure. So partly, we have our the continuity exemption timeline. There's a window for that. There's IDT windows that open up in March. There's the staffing implications, which are really big, and we need to get ahead of those as quick as possible. So for instance, the movement of students from school to school also means the movement of staff from school to school. So there are staffing implications, and we need to have all of that wrapped up in March at the latest, so that we can move forward with, and also tie in the budget development process. So all of the processes are syncing up in the February, early March timeline. And so as Superintendent Perry said, if there are any hiccups in the process, then the implementation of the boundary changes are at risk.
Okay. Director Green?
I don't have any questions on the specific reading, and we'll take a look at all the suggestions and take in mind the testimony we heard tonight. But I do want to thank our co-chairs and the committee for the work they did. I attended several of those boundary discussions at Judson. There were over 200 people in the room the first night, and Adam, I can't remember how many the second night, but I know it was the same as they did those around the district. So really want to thank our co-chairs and the committee for the work that they did and the recommendations that they made to us. It's our decision, but they did the work. So I really just want to thank them for their work and their efforts.
Yeah, I know that the Director Green is speaking for all of us with that compliment. We know that this was not an easy task, and that you went back and you took feedback, and we can't tell you how much we truly appreciate, because you took so much of your personal time and you listened to a lot of concerns and complaints and suggestions from not just the community, but from even those of us that attended the meeting. So we truly, truly appreciate all of your work. Any other discussion, or, and when I say discussion, I mean discussion among all of us, so, okay. So we are going, because that was a first reading, we're going to move on to the next reading, which is with regards to an amendment to Howard Street Charter School Agreement. And this is going to be presented to us by the superintendent and Mike Wolf.
So this is for first reading only. It is a proposal from Howard Street Charter School, and they are asking for two things. One is to increase their student enrollment from 120 to 200 students. And then the second thing they're asking for is some change in contract language that allows them to go out for a bond for indebtedness through not them, but the facilities, Oregon facilities. I don't know the last letter. Authority, thank you. I was going to say association, and that is not it. I couldn't get off. So that's the two recommended changes. In their proposal, they were referring to a template that they have for that bond language, and we do not have that in here tonight. That would be in Paul DeCopolis's hands. And the staff recommendation at this point would be to approve the increase from 180 to 200, and to allow Paul DeCopolis and district staff to work on the correct contract language. Paul DeCopolis has initially reviewed it, and there would be some changes. So do you want to make any comments about that?
This is called an intercept agreement, and the idea is that Howard Street would amend their charter contract, and the district, rather than paying the full amount of the state school funds owed under the contract to the charter school, the district would intercept an amount equal to the bond payment and send that directly to the bond trustee. So it's an unusual arrangement, but there's nothing inherently impossible with this at all. And so this intercept agreement would amend portions of the contract, and I think the important thing for the district is you would not be assuming any liability for the payments if the state school fund went down or for some reason didn't get paid. You'd be held harmless. You're not guaranteeing any payments. You're really acting in much the same way if there was a garnishment. We'd pay the garnishment. We're not liable for the debt. So it's that kind of an arrangement. It would have to be tailored specifically to the charter contract, and the idea would be, if you like this idea, we'll go ahead and do a draft for you to look at your next meeting, where you could have specific questions on the language.
So we have multiple questions. We're going to start with Director Green.
So a couple of things. One, I don't have a problem about the intercept agreement. We currently have one with the State Department of Education on our PERS bonded indebtedness. The state directs payments to our bondholder for our PERS bonds. I'm assuming it's very similar in nature to that. Mm-hmm. The question I do have, and I need to have answered before I'm willing to vote on this, is when they first came to us in December, they wanted 100% funding of the charter school rate for 180 students. They currently only have about 171 kids enrolled. I looked at their ADMW online. At 100%, at 180 students, so I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt that they would have been full, it's a little over $1.4 million that they were asking from us overall. Now they're asking for a little over $1.2 million for 80% funding with 200 students. That's a difference of $156,000. So my question is, how did they make this balance when they were originally asking for about a almost $282,000 increase in funding? Now they're only asking for about $125,000. I need to make sure we look at their budget to assure that it's going to work out for them and pencil out, because while we may not have any legal liability, those are Salem-Keizer kids. If it doesn't pencil out and the math doesn't work in their budget, we would assume those kids back into our district in some way, shape, or form. And so I just want to make sure we've looked at their budget. When they originally asked for 1.4, now they're only asking for 1.2. What changed? Because I just want to make sure we've looked at that budget to assume that they are going to be able to make those payments. Because if they can't and they go away, those kids are going to come back to us in some way, shape, or form. So I need to have those questions answered before we vote on this in February, because I'm not convinced. And they're only asking for 192 students. I actually gave them the difference up to 200. I just need to make sure we're looking at their budget so that it does pencil out.
Okay, we'll bring that back.
And on that point, for clarification, for those of us that aren't familiar with this, so the increase to 200, we automatically pay them 200, or just based on what's actually enrolled?
We base the payments on what their ADMW actually is.
Okay. So
I just assumed 200 for sake of ease of math.
But this would give them the ability to increase their enrollment to 200, which would in effect give them additional funding.
Right, but it's less than what they were originally asking for. So.
Okay. Director Lippold, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, well, it was in regards to the 180 to 200, but it's kind of been answered already.
Okay.
I would like to second what Jim said, though, just because of the difference in the amounts. Because before, we were told very specifically what it was going towards and what it was for. And so now I'd like to see that again with this new proposal. Although I do appreciate the work you guys have been putting into this.
Okay. And I think Director Hine?
Yeah, my question's been asked.
Okay. Yeah, I think we all had the same question. So are there any other questions or comments at this point? Go ahead.
Are we going to hear them present again?
We can hear them present again. I just did not for tonight because I, in the interest of time, wanted to keep it focused on boundaries and figure out what questions you have.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say if you have additional questions that you think of based on this, please provide those to, through the chair. They would go to Mike. So if you think of anything else before the next meeting.
They have, I do know I've connected them with somebody from Oregon Department of Education to work on some of the increase of diversity, because that is a common theme across all charter schools. So they have connected us with some technical assistance for them, so I pass that on to them.
Okay, so that's our two readings, and we do have one action item. And so the action item is with regards to approval of the memo, the MOU between Salem-Keizer School District and Mountain West Career and Technical Education Center.
All right, this is the second reading, so I have put it on the board agenda as an action item. This is our legacy MOU with Mountain West Investments. This will be the MOU that goes into effect after the property transfer. We spent some time last meeting answering questions, and so I'll open it up to see if there's any other questions before the chair moves it for a vote.
So did you, I guess the question was, we did have some feedback. Can you remind us, though, please, what was amended based on some feedback? Do you recall?
Yes, H is amended. There is, it said Suntech could donate to Salem-Keizer School District or another nonprofit. Another nonprofit is taken out of that. And then I think the other major changes were around CRT, and CRT had some requests that they were only in this for 5 years. And we also clarified in 4.1.2 that Mountain West Career Technical Education Center will be paying the $1,000 per month to CRT. It just was not clear in that initial language.
Okay, so I'd ask for a motion.
I'd move approval of the agreement between the district and Mountain West.
We get a second, and then we have
Second.
discussion. Okay, so any discussion? Chair Kyler,
I just wanted to clarify that in the recital E, it talks about that the property has already been donated.
Correct.
I thought I understood you to say that this would go into effect when the property was donated, but the property has already been donated.
The property, the facility, the building has been donated already to CRT.
Okay.
So it's not been donated to us yet.
Okay.
And the land is still in Suntech, and it will require both the building to be donated to us and Suntech, but with the land to be donated to us. So both of those have to happen before this goes into effect.
Okay.
Which includes the final build-out of Phase 5 and the equipment purchases.
And a hexavalent chromium
And a,
review.
Clean
yes, and a
environmental.
clean environmental
That's
before
part
we,
of the-
that's
That's
part of it
the
as well.
MOU.
Okay.
Yeah, that's part of the MOU. Okay, any other discussion before we call for a vote on this? Okay, so all those in favor of the approval of the MOU between the Salem-Keizer School District and CTEC signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by same. So the vote was unanimous, so it 5-0 in favor of adopting the MOU. And we are at the end. I think that is the end. So that is the end of our action items. So that is the end of our meeting this evening. Do we normally call for?
Okay.
Yeah, we're not doing public comment on non-agenda.
Okay, so we are not taking public comment on non-agenda items. So thank you very much, and we are adjourned.